everybody, or afternoon or morning, whenever it is you're taking the time to sit down and watch this. We are continuing on our study of the Gospel of Matthew today. Matthew chapter 24 is where we find ourselves in week 48, averaging a solid one chapter every 2 weeks as we have gone through. I don't know if we should all buy cupcakes when we hit the 1 year mark and celebrate together, or if that should be a time of mourning. The fact that it's been this long. But either way, I hope you have enjoyed and will continue to enjoy our relatively slow walk through Matthew's gospel. We're coming now to the end of the gospel. We've only got a handful of chapters left. Matthew chapter 24 is unique and challenging in a number of ways. And I'm going to try and take the time to kind of talk about some of those difficulties. And some of the historic interpretations that maybe are not the best, would be the nice way to say that, but also how we've come to that point and why interpreting this stuff is challenging. More for what I'm trying to do tonight is to pay attention to how Matthew uses this fairly difficult teaching of Jesus and what it means where it falls in Matthew's gospel. Because, again, we have meaning and then we have original meaning, and then we have how Matthew uses it. And of course, we can't separate those two because we don't have the words from Jesus on hand. What we have is Matthew's rendition, which is not the same as Mark's, which is not the same as Luke's. There are small details that each of them includes or leaves out because they have their own small points that they're making along the way. And so Matthew has some words using Jesus' words to his late first century church about what it means to be faithful in the middle of hardship, why they are experiencing hardship in the first place, and why it's important that their faithfulness is continuous and not sporadic. This is another one of those passages where I think we are reminded that there is a lot of value in reading Scripture seriously, but maybe not always literally. Because what Matthew is doing here, what Jesus was doing originally, I don't think was meant to be read as literally as we have read it in the past. Again, Matthew throws back a lot to the prophets of old, to Isaiah especially. Jesus certainly does as well. And maybe some of those images carry meaning, especially given their late first century setting in Judea or near Judea. Just a couple of things before I tell you to pause the video and read through chapter 24. One, we are taking on a chunk of text tonight, and that's because I want to take a look at chapter 24 as a whole. I'm not going to deal with some of the specifics, and maybe as you read through the chapter, there are some specifics you have questions about that I do not address. Email me, call me, text me, grab me after church. We can talk. I'm always happy to do that. The other thing is that as we read through this, I want you to imagine what it would have been like to be one of Matthew's first readers. So that's going to take some creative imagining on your end because Matthew's early readers were longtime faithful Jewish people who now understand Jesus as fulfillment and as Messiah, but that doesn't mean their community or their feeling that they belong in a specific community, the historic Jewish community, has gone away. It's not like there was the synagogue and then there was the church and it was like an overnight change. That took decades. One of the books on my shelf in my office uses evidence and documents and talks about how really that was 150 years in some places in the making. Like it took that long for that break to truly take place in all areas. Because they don't see themselves as something new. They see themselves as a continuation of who they have always been. And suddenly that's being yanked out from under you. And add to all of that, by the time Matthew writes, the temple, which has been the center of your focus for your entire life, has been destroyed. And so I want you trying to imagine what that sort of chaotic, full of turmoil type experience might be, and hear that chaos as you read through chapter 24. All right, that's enough of that. Pause the video, read through chapter 24, and then unpause the video, and we will continue talking. Enjoy your read. And now we're back. If you paused, read, and unpaused, that was a pretty good break. If you didn't, then it was me drinking a cup of coffee and then coming right back at it. So you understand what I meant when I talked about the challenges chapter 24 poses. We start in the temple precinct, remembering, I know I've mentioned this before, that the temple is like something like 33 acres. It's this huge space. It's not just the temple itself in the middle, but it is this expanded mountaintop of porticos and buildings and teaching spaces and markets and all of that. And that's where Jesus and his disciples have been. And it's this beautiful place. Like Herod invests a ton of money into restoring the temple to something akin to its former glory. The temple would have been, not what it was in Solomon's age, when everything was gold inlaid and all of that. But after the decades that the Herods put into restoring the temple, it is a sight to behold. And so here the disciples, like, looking at the Temple Mount and the temple itself and the porticos and the walls and the stairs and the towers, the corners, and they're just in awe of it. And Jesus says, you're paying attention to the wrong thing. Maybe that's the nice way to say it. It's all going to be destroyed. And the disciples don't know what to do with that. It says that it's later when they finally get around to asking him what he meant. Because they can't imagine a world without the temple. Like, put yourself in their shoes. How could you? And his disciples are like, okay, so what? Like, how do we know? How do we know when it's time? What's really interesting is that what they're asking about, time for what, and what Jesus means, and what Matthew's earliest readers would have understood it to mean, are all not the same thing. Because when we've talked about this before, and it's all over the gospel, the disciples do not have a concept of the crucifixion and resurrection. Like, that is not in their wheelhouse. So when they ask what will be the signal of, your return and the end of the world, and like, they have all of this, historic Jewish apocalyptic imagery in their heads. And if you want a taste of what that looks like, read the second half of Daniel, read the last few chapters of Ezekiel. You can exit biblical scripture and take a look at Jewish writings from the intertestamental period, where you see the scroll of the war and a couple of others. I've got some of those in my office as well. Like, that whole genre of writing was very readily available in the first century Jewish world. And so they're looking towards this moment when Jerusalem becomes the geographic center of the world. It's already the center of their world. They're looking forward to this moment where it's going to be the center of everything. And everything Jesus says after that moment isn't going to square nicely with what they mean. Which just adds to the difficulty they have understanding Jesus. Not that they don't always seem to have some difficulty understanding Jesus. We have some difficulty understanding Jesus, and we've got a couple thousand years of interpretive history to work through. But Jesus then talks about how there's going to be wars and rumors of war, and all of that is not the end. It's just a precursor, and not to get worked up when all of those things happen. And we have read that and then ignored it. Now, I cannot tell you the number of people who I talk to on a regular basis that say something to the effect of, well, this is as bad as the world has ever been, or don't you feel like we're living in the end times, or any other number of combinations of things that hint that direction. And there are a couple things that I would point out. One, that is historically inept. Sorry, it is. The world has been full of people. Therefore, the world has been full of terribleness for a very long period of time. People are great at inventing new ways to be terrible to each other, and that has been true throughout history, repeatedly throughout history. And anything you want to throw out as your version of evidence that this is somehow the worst it's ever been, I can find a historic correlation for it multiple times throughout history because of that. And the other side of it, don't you feel like we're living in the end times? Question that gets asked, repeated somewhat regularly, is we are just the most recent generation to feel that. And that's part of the challenge that Matthew writes to at the end of the first century. And part of why he is so detailed in sharing what Jesus says here with his early readers, more so than Mark and more so than Luke. Matthew leans heavy into it because I think in order to understand exactly what Matthew means when he shares these words from Jesus, we have to pay attention to how it gets bookended. So it starts, Jesus' response starts in verse 4 with the beginning statement, "Don't let anyone mislead you." Which means not only that that was a concern for the disciples specifically, but also that those words are going to carry deep meaning for Matthew's audience specifically. Like, there is a danger of them being misled. And if you pick up at the very end of chapter 24, you get this statement on what a faithful, sensible servant looks like. And if, I mean, you just read this a minute ago, or we're supposed to, cheaters if you didn't, what Matthew describes, what Jesus describes as a faithful, sensible servant is one that remains faithful through the chaos, is not always looking for a way out, and doesn't assume that they can just skate. You get an image of two servants, one who does the work and one who doesn't, and Matthew is holding one of those up as the ideal. And in the middle of it, we get a whole bunch of, nobody knows the date and the time, nobody gets to figure this out, and we get apocalyptic images repeated that come from Daniel and come from Isaiah. Jesus is working with what would have been known and familiar to them. But that doesn't mean what Jesus is providing is a literal description of exactly what's happening. In fact, Jesus makes a statement in the middle of it where he says, nobody knows. So one of those moments where we realize that in at least some ways Jesus is limited is this moment where he says that is knowledge that is reserved for the Father alone. That's not information that I have, and it's not information that I have to share. And people have had a really hard time with that. In fact, so much so that some ancient manuscripts of this passage have removed that verse because they don't have an understanding of how a part of the Godhead, for lack of a better phrase at this moment, could hold back information from another part. How is that, one single deity if there's these divisions that are thrown in? And this is one of those moments where I would remind you that we are severely limited by human language and human brains to understand the divine. And there are some things that we are simply not going to be able to answer. And part of faith is realizing that. And so what we have is this, kind of beginning statement about the danger of deception, the ending statement that says that the goal is to remain faithful no matter what's going on, and then a whole bunch of stuff in the middle that gives us ideas of just how chaotic life was at the first century and what they are experiencing. Now, a couple of verses that have caused some problems for people. Verse 34 especially. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene until all of these things take place. Heaven and earth will disappear, but my words will never disappear. So a couple things. This generation could also mean this age, or it could mean this nation. And if you read that literally, then Jesus is wrong. If what you take that to mean is that Jesus is saying that this great cosmic end that's being discussed will take place before the literal people alive at that age are talking about, then, I mean, we're still here. You could understand this as Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple. We start with questions about when the temple is going to come down. And so if that's the direction that you want to try and read this, it makes sense. There are a couple of problems with reading it that way. Mainly, the world keeps going after the destruction of the temple, or our world keeps going after the destruction of the temple. Maybe not their world, and maybe that's a figurative reading that we are meant to pick up there, and maybe that's what Matthew's hoping his audience will understand. He could be talking about Christians in general, that what is being created is a new people, and that's an option. I don't think it's a good one, but it certainly helps take out the confusion. The other possibility that people have struggled with is if we're already talking about Jesus not knowing when the end comes, if we're already talking about some of that being limited, then maybe what we have here is Matthew putting words in Jesus' mouth or Jesus' own best guess, which again makes people uncomfortable, but it's one of those ideas that's out there in writing, and I don't want you to be surprised when you stumble across it. I don't think that's it. I think instead what we are on the receiving end of here is something that is meant to be understood as repetitive. Jesus throws back to Isaiah, who saw the destruction of the temple, the first temple, and holds in front of his readers pretty constantly this notion that focus on the wrong place tends to bring about the destruction of that thing. And maybe what we are meant to understand here is that this is one of those cycles that continues going. And so what Jesus says here is certainly true for them, but that ending is not the end, and we continue on. What I know as I read through this and think maybe this is helpful in our current world is that it's not my job to try and figure out when the end is. Lots of people have been doing this for a very long time. The comet gets closer and lots of people drink Kool-Aid because it's the end. Or the stars align and so therefore this must be the world. When I was in college, there was a cult in town that had predicted the end of the world on a number of occasions. They'd swung and missed. And it was supposed to end at least once while I was in school, maybe twice. But they had made that their mission, is that whole picking and predicting. And what's really funny is they did so based off of Scripture, and often based off Scriptures where the overall message is, don't worry about that. You have other responsibilities. And that's Matthew's ultimate goal here. To his early readers is to remind them that it is not about the end. It is not the most important aspect. Instead, what is important is that they be faithful disciples in whatever situation and in whatever time they find themselves. Because predicting the end is not an act of faith. It's not a spiritual responsibility. Living faithful no matter what is. And when you put your focus on the wrong thing, whether that's the temple or the end or what have you, you will inevitably end up missing the mark in discipleship. And that's the message that Jesus is trying to communicate. All right, I think that takes care of us for chapter 24. Again, if you have questions, feel free to call, text, email. I will do my best to answer them. This is one of those passages where I will tell you flat out, I do not know. What you heard is my best guess, but this is one of many passages where a plain, simple reading simply does not work out. And so we are reminded that there are some things that we are simply limited on. And that's, not only is that okay, but that's probably a good thing. If our job was to figure everything out, then we would inevitably fail. So instead, it is to be faithful in spite of all of the facts that all of the stuff we don't know. and work from there. All right, glad y'all are with us. Catch you again next week as we pick up in chapter 25.